I'd be nothing but a broken record if I were to repeat the mantra that small cars are the best cars. But of course, small cars are the best cars, and there's a very good reason the Italians are perceived to be the best in the business. To be honest with you, I've gone on about the Mini far too much on TwinCam, and while I stand by my statement that it was the most influential car ever made, it was very quickly overtaken by Turin. Even if we ignore the Fiat 500, the Mini's formula was vastly improved in the 1960s, culminating in the Fiat 127 of 1971. But we're in 1983 for its successor, and a quiet revolution that produced the first truly grown-up Supermini, the Fiat Uno. All the way back in 1959, the BMC Mini was considered a revolution in car design, achieving packaging supremacy through a transverse engine and front-wheel drive, defining the template for the modern car. Yet anyone who's ever owned a Mini will swiftly tell you that Izagones' baby wasn't perfect, and only 5 years later, its engineering was rendered obsolete. Meanwhile, a man named Dante Giacosa was the Fiat Group's director of engineering, and he'd been in that role for a number of years, overseeing cars like the iconic Fiat 500, which predated the Mini by 2 years. However, its engineering was simple. It had a rear-mounted longitudinal 2-cylinder engine driving the rear wheels, and as soon as he saw the Mini, he realised where the future lay. In 1964, Giacosa and Fiat debuted the Autobianchi Primula, a small family car that took the Mini's principles, removed the bouncy suspension, and replaced the problematic in-sump gearbox with unequal length driveshafts and an on-end gearbox. This is the actual formula for the modern car. But in the early days, Fiat were hedging their bets. They launched it as an Autobianchi to protect the core company from failure. But as the 60s progressed, they realised its value and developed 2 all-new Fiats based on this philosophy: 1969's Fiat 128 and 1971's Fiat 127. The latter of these is the one we're interested in, because alongside the Simca 1100 and Renault 5, the 127 was part of an all-new class of cars, those that became the Superminis. When presented like this, the name becomes obvious, but the 127 was a proper game changer, bringing McPherson strut front suspension to the party and laying out the future for companies like Volkswagen and Ford to latch onto as the decade progressed. But as the 70s turned into the 80s, Fiat were tasked with replacing it, the product being the Uno we have with us today. Every manufacturer, no matter how big, finds it phenomenally difficult to replace a game changer. Not only does the new car have a lot to live up to, but it also has to usurp every other manufacturer that's brought along a car since, while still upping the game again. During the 127's life, we didn't just see the Renault 5, but also the Volkswagen Polo, the Ford Fiesta and the Austin Metro, all of which made the 127 look like yesterday's cars. But in turn, the Uno was a revolution of its own, making those 3 cars look like yesterday's cars. Because while the 127 was mechanically impressive, its finish left quite a lot to be desired. So that's how the Uno succeeded, by tackling that issue head on. It's funny to look back and see Autobianchi as the beginning of Fiat's revolution, because they again were responsible for the Uno. The main company was umming and ahhing over a second 127 facelift, while the lads over at Lancia were already developing what they thought would be a new Autobianchi. In fact, back in 1969, Autobianchi managed to beat the 127 to market by 2 years with the A112, and this is the car the Lancia engineers were looking to replace. So where exactly was the main body of Fiat? Well, alongside another 127 facelift, they were preoccupied with another car, one that became a total design classic, the original Fiat Panda. The Panda sat in the class below the 127 and Uno, replacing the Fiat 126, which in turn was a rebodied Fiat 500, meaning it was still rocking about with a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine. The Panda would bring the front-drive revolution into Fiat's smallest line of cars, but this adorable little thing was so much more than that. The Panda was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, and Giugiaro wasn't exactly a stranger to a spectacular challenge of a car, because he'd done the Alfa 105 coupes, the De Tomaso Mangusta, the Maserati Ghibli and Maserati Bora, the Alfa Sud, the Volkswagen Scirocco and the Volkswagen Golf. He'd done the Lotus Esprit, the BMW M1, and he'd just done the Delta for Lancia. He was then tasked with doing the Panda, and we all know about the boxy shape, the minimalist interior, the flat glass even. But the Panda was designed to be the automotive equivalent of a pair of jeans. The Panda was all about intelligent practicality, and that gig led directly to the Uno some 3 years later. So what do we mean by intelligent practicality? Well, the Mini is the opposite of that. While it was very clever on the surface, it had mechanical issues and it felt like a product of austerity. The Panda may have been a product of austerity, but it was mechanically solid and it had every feature one might expect. So when we turn to the Uno, this is a conventional Supermini. However, it is infinitely more practical than the 127. It is easier to drive than the 127. It is more efficient than the 127. It is faster than the 127. And most importantly, it is more comfortable than the 127. And I mean those adjectives in their broadest possible terms. The Fiat Uno, therefore, was a laser-focused design that meant it was the first Supermini with no compromises. And the first place we can see that is within the styling. It's a good-looking little car. There's no flair and it is absolutely inoffensive. But this is Giugiaro we're talking about. So instead of inoffensive meaning bland, there's just enough in the profile and in little design choices to make it unique, but also timeless. This car may have launched in 1983 and this is a facelift one. But it wouldn't look all that old-fashioned in 2003. And of course, with it being a Fiat product, it was built through to 2014 in South America. But back to the point of our intelligent practicality, and the Uno is 5 centimeters longer than the old 127. That's a pretty average increase in size for a new generation, but notice the silhouette. Comparatively, the Uno has a shorter bonnet, a higher roofline and a much steeper hatchback. In fact, the car is also 5 centimeters taller, and that has a much larger effect than you might imagine. By increasing the height, you can position the passengers differently, increasing legroom in the process. And thanks to the estate car rear end, the boot can be the same size while moving back the rear seats. Therefore, the car feels as though it's a whole size up rather than just 5 centimeters longer. That's the genius of this car's packaging, because it took what was a cramped little car and turned it into more of a small family car. It seems we've now hit 2 targets from merely the styling of this car. But there's one left to go, because in the 1970s, car manufacturers rarely cared for aerodynamics. But thanks to rising fuel prices, everybody suddenly started pretending it was the 1930s again and aggressively streamlined their cars. In this period, it wasn't unusual for the drag coefficient of a small car to be up at 0.4 or even higher. The 127s, for example, was 0.45. That of the Fiat Uno, 0.33. That's only a stone's throw away from the Audi 100 and Ford Sierra, 2 cars that in the year before were lauded for their aerodynamic capabilities in spite of being big family cars. But here was the little Uno replicating that slipperiness. We've only covered the styling of this car so far, yet it was orchestrated so well that the entire car is already improved, and that's all Fiat had to really work on. that presentation of the thing when compared to the 127, because as I mentioned before, that thing was mechanically brilliant back in 1971. And so it won't surprise you to hear that everything underneath is very, very familiar. This car is all new, but it won't surprise you to hear that that consists of McPherson struts at the front and a coil-sprung twist beam at the back. Now, back in 1968, when the A112 was launched, that was all brand new. But in 2023, that's the standard for the vast majority of cars. And so it also won't surprise you to hear that the Uno does not drive like a 40-year-old car. To be quite honest with you, it's quite unremarkable in the way it drives so far, but that's a good thing. When you approach these older cars, if it drives interestingly, like I so love with the BMC front drive stuff and the hydroelastic stuff, that's not always a good thing. Some cars can be interesting because they're not all that user-friendly to drive, but this feels like such a well-rounded and normal package. So first of all, I want to talk about the driving position. Now that sounds a little bit strange having just come from suspension, but we'll get back to it because it matters. The fact that Giugiaro decided this car was going to be so tall means that the driving position is totally different to any of the other Superminis from this era, because its driving position again feels very modern. It feels like all the modern Fiats, like the Panda and the 500, because you're so upright in the car. I feel far taller than I actually am in this thing. You sit very much like you're sat on a chair at home, then reaching across to the pedals and steering wheel. So it doesn't exactly feel like a low-slung sports car to drive. It does feel like it's on stilts ever so slightly. But by virtue of McPherson struts and a twist beam, it's so easy to drive. No power steering, of course, as you would expect. And there is a bit of a dead zone in the centre. The steering isn't quite as sharp as you'd find on a Metro, for example. But when you do reach the travel of the steering, it has such a nice crisp turn-in. And while there is a little bit of disconcerting roll, I'm used to body rolling cars. That's normal, I'm not surprised by it. But because I'm sat so high up, I just need to take a second to gain the confidence of this thing. But now that I've been driving it for a few minutes, I've got all that confidence. Now it is quite softly sprung, but it isn't all that comfortable. And that is kind of par for the course with struts and twist beam. It doesn't really take up all the imperfections in the road like you might want it to. But what it is very good at is informing you. And so while it doesn't have a perfect ride quality, it's soft and comfortable enough, don't get me wrong, it brings that all back in when it comes to communication. This is a really fun little car to beat about in. It feels so eager to turn in and doesn't feel really all that tied down to the road, which means that it feels like you're driving so much faster than you actually are. It kind of, the front end floats across the road a little bit, sometimes disconcertingly, but it always picks up once you actually lean on it. What the suspension is quite good at picking up on actually is continued imperfections in the road. Single ridges and potholes it's not quite so great at, but when there's a pattern of things going on, like you're going over a cattle grid or a railway crossing, or the road generally has a bump in it, it just sort of seems to just cancel that out completely. And so the more I drive it, the more I realise, oh, actually there's a bit more nuance to what I initially said about the suspension. Yeah, I'm feeling myself treating this 33-year-old Fiat with a 40-year-old design like a modern car, rather than like something with a manual choke. Now, coming back to the driving position a little bit again now, and I want to talk about the pedals. The reason I want to mention them is because, well, they're a little bit uncomfortable just because of how upright you sit in the car, but that's besides the point. The point is the fact that the throttle pedal is suspiciously shaped and suspiciously placed to make it incredibly easy to heel and tow. Some cars are easy to rev match in totally by accident. You can tell that they didn't think of it when designing it, it's just total fluke. This car, the way that throttle pedal looks and is placed, I wouldn't be surprised if the folks at Fiat thought it through before designing it into the car. And that's fantastic. It's the Italians, they know what they're doing. They really do know what they're doing. I'm noticing as I push on a little bit that it just wants to push into a really nicely controlled understeer. Again, easy to drive. Really easy to drive, and I think that brings us in to how hospitable it is in here, because this is a car designed in 1983, and I need to keep reminding myself that, because while, you know, the type of materials used in here and the styling and the hard plastic steering wheel does feel like an older car, the noise levels in here, the general refinement in here, the way you feel detached from the road and the way you do feel bumps when they come is so modern. You got to remember that in the 1970s, people in Britain were, you know, knocking about in, of course, Minis and things like Allegros and Marinas and Mark II Ford Escorts and stuff like that. The 80s come around and we do get a bit of a revolution. We've got front drive Vauxhalls, we've got the front drive Ford Escort and the Ford Fiesta, but compare the Fiesta to this, and the Fiesta is cramped, the Fiesta is noisy, and the Fiesta is harsh. And also, the Fiesta's dashboard looks as though it is designed kind of with austerity in mind. The Mark I Metro's dashboard is exactly the same. It's not designed to look attractive, it's designed to do a job. This thing is designed to do both. It is attractive, if a little plain, but it's still just as practical. It's such a massive move on from what came before it, this car. And the 127, I've not done a video on a 127 yet on this channel. I will be doing at some point. I have one that has been offered to me. But I've sat in that very 127, and that's a 127 Series 2. That's a car from 1979. And it feels dark and dingy. It's all black vinyl and black plastics, and this car is just so much brighter. It feels so much more alive than the 127. I can't imagine how much of a big deal this car was in 1983. Fiat became known for how well their cars drove in the 1970s. There's a reason I won't stop harping on about the X19 I drove last year. Yet their suspension wasn't the centre of attention. Instead, it was their engines. Initially, the 127's engines were carried straight over to the Uno, the most basic of these being the little 903cc overhead valve engine. That sounds like nothing special, and you'd be correct. But it's worth mentioning as nearly all Superminis were stuck with overhead valve engines. The Austin Metro with nothing but overhead valves through to 1990. But further up the range was the spectacular overhead camshaft Lampredi engine. This is the one I fell so madly in love with in the X19, engineered by former Ferrari man Aurelio Lampredi. However, from 1985, Unos began being fitted with the engine you could still get in brand new Fiats through to 2020. The Fire. The fully integrated robotised engine is the one this has in all its glory at 999cc. Now, the Fire, not the Fire engine, because that would be fully integrated robotised engine. The fire was developed in order to lower production costs and lower man hours, and that mattered, frankly, in Italy in the 1980s. And as a result, it is incredibly easy for them to build. It uses less parts, it's lighter, it uses cheaper materials, and so on paper, it's not an incredibly forward-looking engine. Back in 1969, the old Lampredi overhead cam engine was startlingly modern for, you know, a mainstream range of cars to have fitted. But by the mid-80s, an overhead camshaft wasn't unusual at all. So the Fire is single overhead camshaft, aluminium cylinder head, but with an iron block and of course 2 valves per cylinder. So nothing revolutionary, and you wouldn't really expect that, because at this point, what else is there? 16 valves in a base model car? It just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen for well more than another decade, so you can't have expected anything more. But because Fiat already had history in the technology, in that style of engines, that's probably part of why it lasted for so long, because they just engineered it right. So this 1 litre engine has, as you might expect, 45 brake horsepower, because Fiat, unlike all the silly other manufacturers, just put the power output of their cars on the side, which is better. I like that. So this Fiat Uno 45 has 45 brake horsepower. And it's not a lot. It's not a lot even for a 1 litre engine, really. It's average for its era when, you know, things like the Metro were producing that power from its 998cc overhead valve engine. But that means it's a bit understressed, which means it's better for reliability. But also, the difference is the character of this engine. Because at first glance, it can seem a little bit out of puff, because it's not flushed with all that much torque, but it's got all the top end. And in that regard, it feels like a Fiat engine. No surprises there. It's all revvy, it wants you to pick it up and play with it, rather than to be a workhorse. But if we shift down to second and give it some beans, it might be a bit conflicted for you lot hearing it, because it sounds a bit diesely. It doesn't sound very nice. It doesn't have the sonority of the old Lampredi engine, not at all. It does sound diesely, and you might expect it therefore to be a bit rough, but weirdly it isn't. It sounds rough, but it feels lovely and smooth, and that comes back to the point I was making before about how nice it is to be in here. It's got a lovely smooth engine that just works away in front of you. If you turn up the radio a little bit, then it'll be grand. But in spite of only having that 45 brake horsepower, it works so beautifully well. All of the revs, and it loves it. I do think this one has a small exhaust blow, just a bit, which won't be helping things, but it feels so lovely to use. It's a fun car to drive. It's so eager and just fun to take out. And it gets up to speed reasonably enough. We're now just hitting 60 miles per hour, and that's perfectly nice for your little 1 litre engine back in 1985. The gear change is really nice though. So I've not got much experience with Fiat gear changes. The X19 I drove, which of course was mid-engine, so very different thing, that had an issue with the gear change in it, so I didn't comment on it. And this one, it's got quite a lot of throw between the gears, but the gate's very, very close. It's a really accurate, precise, positive gear change, and it matches up with the car really well, because the steering is, once you get past the centre point, is nice and positive as well. A bit low geared maybe, but yeah, it's a lovely little car to drive. Fun. The Fire, along with the Uno itself and the larger Fiat Ritmo, were part of Fiat's well-publicised move towards automation, which improved the consistency of their cars, and with such a fundamentally sensible design behind it, it wasn't a surprise to see much of the competition be left in its wake. It feels infinitely more modern than any Supermini before, but in the same year, we'd meet the Peugeot 205. The 205 is now considered the high watermark for a great classic Supermini, and fair enough. The 205 is undoubtedly more dependable and better regarded as a driver's car. But let's remember back to 1984. The Uno was such a good family car that it easily eclipsed the 205 on its way to winning European Car of the Year. While the Uno would never be the most desirable car in its class, it was certainly one of the most sensible, and in the long run, definitely the most successful. Fiat have always been known for their small cars, but over the decades and with a few platform modifications, they sold around 9 million Unos, making this one of the most produced cars in history. We cannot underestimate how intelligently Fiat were designing their cars in this period, because with the industrial turmoil and quality issues we so often hear about, always associated with Italian cars of the 70s and 80s, you'd expect them to turn inwards. But they didn't. They were still out there looking for that next advance, and in the process, they turned the whole Supermini segment away from the concepts of economy and sacrifice towards them being all the car you'd ever really need. That's why 1983 was so important, because this is the first of what I like to term the second generation of Superminis, sat alongside the Peugeot 205. And those two cars took the Supermini away from, as I said, that sense of sacrifice and towards a car you wouldn't think twice about just hopping into and crossing a country in. For that, all modern Superminis owe this unassuming little Fiat a massive debt. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.